The air in the St. Regis ballroom tasted like champagne and betrayal. I was wearing a cheap dress in a room built for women in diamonds, feeling the shame burn hotter than any fever. My mother was dying slowly, piece by piece, suffocated by medical bills that were paper monsters. Then he appeared, Dr. Julian Vance, the brilliant billionaire, the Ice King himself. He looked at me, a waitress from the Loop Diner, and offered me salvation permanent care for my mother, freedom from debt. But salvation came with a price tag, written in blood, pretend to be my wife. I signed the contract with a trembling hand, selling myself for a miracle. I thought the lie was the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part was Article 11. He built a legal fortress to keep my heart out, a clause that said if I or he ever dared to feel genuine love, the contract would terminate, and my mother's life support would be pulled. He gave me everything, but demanded I forfeit the one thing I couldn't control. My name is Clara Jensen. This is my story. I'm about to share something close to my heart. But before I do, can you say hi in the comments? Or tell me where you're from. I love hearing how far my story reaches. It's always good to know I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. If my story touches you, please consider hitting subscribe. It helps this story find others who might need to hear it, and it gives me the courage to keep sharing. The air in the St. Regis ballroom tasted like champagne and betrayal. I was wearing a cheap dress in a room built for women in diamonds, feeling the shame burn hotter than any fever. My mother was dying slowly, piece by piece, suffocated by medical bills that were paper monsters. Then he appeared, Dr. Julian Vance, the brilliant billionaire, the Ice King himself. He looked at me, a waitress from the Loop Diner, and offered me salvation permanent care for my mother, freedom from debt. But salvation came with a price tag written in blood, pretend to be my wife. I signed the contract with a trembling hand, selling myself for a miracle. I thought the lie was the hardest part. I was wrong. The hardest part was Article 11. He built a legal fortress to keep my heart out, a clause that said if I or he ever dared to feel genuine love, the contract would terminate, and my mother's life support would be pulled. He gave me everything but demanded I forfeit the one thing I couldn't control. My name is Clara Jensen. This is my story. I'm about to share something close to my heart. But before I do, can you say hi in the comments or tell me where you're from? I love hearing how far my story reaches. It's always good to know I'm not alone in this. Thank you. And now, let me tell you everything. If my story touches you, please consider hitting subscribe. It helps this story find others who might need to hear it, and it gives me the courage to keep sharing. The air in the St. Regis ballroom tasted like iced champagne and ambition, a lethal cocktail that Clara Jensen could barely swallow. Her simple dress felt like a uniform in this shimmering, hostile galaxy of diamonds and predatory smiles. She wasn't a guest. She was an anthropological study, a relic from the wrong side of the tracks, forced to witness her childhood friend marry into a world designed to exclude her. Across the polished floor, Dr. Julian Vance was enduring his own gilded torment. The neurosurgeon, a man whose hands held the secrets of life and death, was trapped not by a scalpel, but by his mother, Vivienne Vance. The matriarch, draped in designer couture, was orchestrating a subtle, suffocating coup, pushing a vacuous heiress into his orbit. "She's flawless, Julian." His mother hissed, her voice cutting through the soft violin arrangement. 5 generations summering in Martha's Vineyard. You need stability. You need appropriateness. Julian's jaw locked. His recent messy divorce had only fueled his mother's aggressive campaign. He felt like a rare specimen being prepped for public auction. His eyes, sharp and analytical, sought an exit and found a reflection of his own desperation in her. He saw the girl by the flower display, quiet, unpretentious, with a gaze that held a fierce, unyielding defiance. She was being verbally quartered by an entitled man, reeking of old money and cheap whiskey. "Are you with the catering staff?" the man drawled, looking her up and down as if checking a receipt. "Fetch me a scotch." The insult hit like a physical blow. Clara felt the blood rush from her face, her knuckles white around her worn handbag. Humiliation was about to drive her out. And in that frozen moment, Julian moved. It was a purely instinctive, reckless decision, a desire to solve two problems with one audacious stroke and an unbidden, powerful urge to save the girl. Humor, he cut off his mother mid-sentence and crossed the ballroom with the singular focus of a surgeon racing to the OR. He stopped beside Clara, ignoring the gasping onlookers and the sputtering drunk. He leaned in, his body language proprietary, his voice a low, confidential rumble meant only for her. "Pretend to be my wife." Clara's world tilted. Dr. Julian Vance, the face of every medical journal, the billionaire Ice King, was speaking to her. "What?" She managed, her breath catching. "Don't hesitate," he murmured, his eyes glittering with a thrilling, dangerous calculation. "Play the role. I will secure your future." He took her hand, his palm warm, his grip authoritative. Turning to face his astonished mother, he pulled Clara close, claiming her with impossible ease. "Mother," he announced, his voice smooth and carrying across the hushed crowd. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Clara. We were saving the announcement, but I suppose there's no time like the present." A wave of collective shock rippled through the elite. Julian's mother looked devastated. The arrogant guest stood slack-jawed. Julian unleashed a blinding performance-grade smile. He raised Clara's hand, kissing her knuckles with theatrical devotion, his gray eyes pinning her in place. "Darling," he purred, his voice a velvet promise. "It seems they're playing our song." For the rest of the evening, they were a perfectly constructed lie. His presence was a fortress. His hand never left the small of her back, a gesture of possessive intimacy that sent a chaotic electric current through her. He whispered dry, witty comments that pulled real, surprised laughter from her. Dancing in his arms, she was intoxicated by a sense of belonging she had never known. The fantasy felt more real than her actual life. The night ended at the grand entrance. The performance was over. "You were utterly convincing," he said, his professional composure restored, though a residual warmth lingered in his eyes. "You're a master of deflection yourself, Doctor," she replied, her heart still hammering. He produced a slim black business card. "I will be initiating contact." He vanished into a sleek black car, leaving her alone on the cold curb, the lingering heat of his touch, a mocking contrast to the lonely night air. The next week was a whiplash return to reality. The champagne memory faded into the overwhelming scent of grease and stale coffee from her double shifts at the Loop Diner. The arrival of new monstrous medical bills for her mother was the final blow. Clara felt the walls closing in. Then the world stilled. The sudden collective silence announced his arrival, a hush she had only witnessed among the elite. Dr. Julian Vance stood framed in the doorway, a king in a flawlessly tailored suit who had deliberately sought out a peasant's hovel. His presence commanded the space, bypassing the staring patrons and landing directly on her. "Miss Jensen," he stated, his voice a low, calm, surgical command. "I believe we have business that requires immediate discussion." He ushered her into a secluded booth, wasting no time on pleasantries. "I have conducted a review of your financial and medical status." He began, his tone cold, clinical, and devastatingly informed. "Your mother's congestive heart failure, the accumulating debt, the insufficiency of your 2 current jobs to cover essential medication." He laid out her desperation as if dissecting a chart. Clara burned with shame and a powerless rage. "I propose a formal arrangement." He continued, his gray eyes intense and purely analytical. "A contract for 1 year. You will assume the public duties of my wife, attending social and corporate functions, maintaining the flawless illusion we established." Not his next words landed with shattering weight. "In exchange, I will clear every outstanding family debt immediately. Furthermore, your mother will be relocated to a private suite at Vance Metropolitan Hospital. She will receive comprehensive care from the finest cardiac team, with all costs, every test, every procedure, every prescription fully covered. She will want for nothing. It was salvation, a divine lifeline thrown into the dark, churning waters that threatened to drag her under. It was everything she had fought and prayed for. But a man of his calculated power never acted without an ultimate failsafe. "Why me?" she whispered. "Why this? You are a study in pragmatism." He answered, his voice devoid of emotion. "Intelligent, controlled under pressure, and you possess a powerful, transparent motivation to fulfill this contract to the letter. You are a predictable variable in a life I choose to keep predictable." He leaned in, delivering the ultimate caveat. "My previous marriage taught me the cost of volatility. Therefore, love is a liability. Emotions are a variable I will not tolerate again." He slid a sleek tablet across the table. The contract appeared dense and unforgiving. She found it Article 11, Emotional Attachment Termination Clause. The terms were chilling. The contract hinged on the relationship remaining purely transactional. Should either party develop and confess genuine romantic attachment, the contract would be terminated immediately. All ongoing financial benefits, including her mother's permanent, life-saving medical care, would cease. It was a brilliantly engineered diabolical trap. Honesty meant ruin. Lying meant becoming the deception he despised. "This is impossible." She breathed, her heart slamming against her ribs. "It punishes having a heart." "It is a safeguard." He countered, his voice sharp as a scalpel. "I transact in certainty, Miss Jensen. My terms are absolute." She looked from his mask of detached control to the image of her exhausted mother. The decision was no decision at all. Debt was the rock. This heartless contract was the hard place. With a trembling finger, she pressed the digital signature line. The word accepted glowed. She had traded her heart for her mother's life. The transition to Julian's minimalist fortress in the Willis Tower was a terrifying, silent blur. Her new suite in the East Wing was vast, luxurious, and sterile. Julian emphasized the rule, "My suite is in the West Wing. The physical distance reinforces emotional clarity." Remember the clause. Her debut as the wife at a hospital fundraising dinner 2 nights later was dizzying. Stylists transformed her into a creature of high society, with designer gowns and diamonds. Julian awaited her impossibly handsome in his tuxedo. Acceptable. He judged the single word delivered with the sterile warmth of a lab report. Yet as he escorted her, she felt a fleeting telltale tremor in the hand resting on the small of her back, a betrayal of his cool facade. At the event, he was a virtuoso of pretense. The devoted husband, his smile, a dazzling shield. He whispered witty, possessive words close to her ear, sending confusing jolts through her with every touch. The performance was flawless. The most volatile moment came when Vivian Vance approached, her eyes narrowed in scrutiny. "Well, Julian," his mother said, her gaze raking over Clara. "You are full of surprises." "Clara is the best surprise of my life." Julian smoothly countered, pulling her in and pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her cheek. It was a flawless public display, but the warmth of his lips, the unexpected tenderness, made Clara's eyes flutter shut. In that fractional second, she knew with terrifying certainty he felt it too. The drive home was suffocating. The silent living room was charged with the ghost of that intimate moment. "You performed well tonight." Julian said, his voice strained, avoiding her gaze. "You too," she replied, her voice barely a whisper. The silent acknowledgement of the crack in their perfect armor was paralyzing. He physically retreated, backing away. "Good night, Clara." He clipped his voice cold and formal, retreating to the safety of the West Wing. "Good night, Julian," she whispered to the empty room. He was denying the undeniable. The dangerous, thrilling spark was real, and the impossible game had escalated. The stress of her new double life, the constant performance, the gnawing anxiety of upholding the contract, the emotional whiplash of Julian's hot and cold behavior began to take its toll. A week after the dinner, Clara woke up with a scratchy throat and a dull headache. She dismissed it as exhaustion, popping a couple of painkillers and plastering a bright smile on her face. She had a full day of duties, including accompanying Julian to a luncheon with the hospital's board of trustees. She couldn't afford to show any weakness. By midday, however, the headache was a pounding drum behind her eyes, and a feverish chill had begun to creep into her bones. She felt dizzy and weak, but she pushed through her pride, refusing to let her falter. They were standing in the pre-lunch reception when it happened. She was listening to the chairman drone on about hospital expansion plans when the room suddenly tilted, the edges of her vision going dark. She swayed on her feet, reaching out a hand to steady herself against a nearby table. Julian, who had been deep in conversation across the room, saw it instantly. His head snapped up, his clinical gaze zeroing in on her with laser-like focus. He saw her pale face, the slight tremor in her hand, the sheen of sweat on her brow. In a move that stunned the entire room, he abruptly cut off the person he was speaking to, strode across the reception hall, and took her by the arm. "Excuse us," he announced to the bewildered chairman, his voice a low, firm command. "My wife is not feeling well. We're leaving." He didn't wait for a response. He guided her out of the room, his hand a firm, supportive presence on her back, ignoring the whispers and stares that followed them. "I'm fine," she protested weakly in the elevator. "I just felt a little dizzy." "You're not fine," he countered, his voice leaving no room for argument. He placed the back of his hand against her forehead, his touch surprisingly gentle. "You have a fever. You're going home, and you're going to bed." It was an order delivered with the full force of his authority as both her contractual husband and a doctor. Back at the penthouse, he didn't just send her to her room. He followed her, his concern palpable. "Get into bed," he instructed. "I'll be right back." He returned a few minutes later with a thermometer medication and a glass of water. He took her temperature with a practiced efficiency, his expression grim as he read the result. 102. "It's a flu," he diagnosed. "You've been running yourself ragged." For the rest of the day, he became her reluctant, hyper-efficient nurse. He canceled all of his afternoon surgeries, a move she knew was practically unheard of. He brought her soup, which he had apparently bullied his private chef into making from scratch. He made sure she was hydrated, that she took her medication on schedule. He was brusque, his bedside manner clinical, but his actions spoke louder than his words. His worry was a tangible thing in the room. That night, the fever spiked. She drifted in and out of a restless, feverish sleep, plagued by disjointed dreams. At one point, she felt a cool hand on her forehead and whimpered, half asleep. "Shh, it's all right," a low voice murmured from the darkness. "Just the fever." She cracked her eyes open to see Julian sitting in the chair beside her bed, a dim lamp casting long shadows across his face. He was watching her, his expression unguarded in the darkness. "You're still here," she mumbled. "I'm here," he confirmed softly. He reached out to check her temperature again, his hand cool and steady on her hot skin. As his hand rested on her forehead, his thumb, in a slow, unconscious gesture, stroked her temple. It was a simple, soothing motion, a gesture of pure, unthinking tenderness. It was not the action of a doctor with a patient or a man fulfilling a contract. It was an act of genuine care. He seemed to realize what he was doing at the same moment she did. He snatched his hand back as if he had been burned, a look of shock and self-reproach flashing across his face. He stared at his own hand, then at her, his jaw tight with a sudden fierce irritation, an irritation directed entirely at himself. He had broken his own cardinal rule. He had allowed an emotional variable to enter the equation. Without another word, he stood up and walked out of the room, leaving her alone in the darkness, her skin still tingling. He was terrified she realized not of her or of the flu, but of the undeniable, terrifying truth his own heart was betraying him. After Clara recovered from the flu, a new fragile tension settled between them. Julian's act of care and his subsequent panicked retreat had been a silent confession. They both knew he had felt something, and they both knew they couldn't talk about it. They tiptoed around each other, their conversations painfully polite, their interactions meticulously professional, each of them desperately trying to reinforce the crumbling walls of their contract. The universe, however, seemed to have other plans. "We have to go to San Diego," Julian announced one evening, his tone brusque, his eyes fixed on a file he was reading. "San Diego?" Clara asked, surprised. "There's a neurosymposium at the Pacific Coast Medical Center," he explained, still not looking at her. "I'm the keynote speaker. As my devoted wife, your presence is expected. We leave Friday." The thought of being trapped with him for 3 days in the sun-drenched city was both terrifying and exhilarating. San Diego was a dream, but for Clara and Julian, it was a beautiful torture chamber. To maintain their public image, they were forced into a constant performative intimacy that felt dangerously real. They had to share a suite with separate bedrooms, of course, but a shared living space. They had to walk arm in arm through the cobblestone streets, posing for pictures for the hospital's social media team who were documenting the trip. On their first afternoon, they were instructed to get some romantic shots for the hospital's newsletter. They found themselves standing on the Coronado Bridge, a professional photographer directing them. "Closer," the photographer called out. "Dr. Vance, put your arm around her." Mrs. Vance laughed. "Look at him like you adore him." Julian's arm felt like a brand around her waist. Clara forced a laugh, tilting her head back to look at him, and was startled by the look in his eyes. He was looking down at her, not with the cool detachment of a business partner, but with a raw, unguarded intensity that made her breath catch. "Perfect!" the photographer shouted. Later, they bought gelato and sat on the steps of a piazza, the warm San Diego sun on their faces. For a moment, they forgot they were performing. They talked, really talked about the art, the history, the beauty of the city. He told her about a summer he had spent here as a medical student, and she told him about her dream of one day sketching the historic lighthouse. They laughed at a joke he made, a real shared laugh that echoed in the sunlit square. It was easy. It was natural. It was terrifying. The breaking point came on their last night. After the symposium's formal dinner, they decided to walk back to the hotel, the air warm and scented with jasmine. They wandered through the quiet, winding streets, their footsteps echoing on the ancient stones. They stumbled upon a small, hidden piazza where a lone violinist was playing a hauntingly beautiful, romantic melody. A few other couples were scattered around, listening, wrapped up in each other. Julian and Clara stopped, drawn in by the music. They stood there in the soft glow of the gas lamps, not speaking, just listening. The music swelled a melody of longing and love, and it seemed to fill the space between them, saying everything they couldn't. In the middle of the small crowd under the Pacific moonlight, he turned to look at her. The world around them seemed to melt away. There were no cameras, no colleagues, no contract. There was only the music, the moonlight, and the undeniable truth in his eyes. He saw her, not Miss Jensen, his contractual wife, not the woman from the diner. He saw Julian, and she saw him, not the billionaire surgeon, but the man who had cared for her when she was sick, the man who had laughed with her over gelato. Slowly, inevitably, he began to lean in. The desire in his eyes was a clear, unambiguous confession. His lips were inches from hers. This was it. The moment they had both been dreading and secretly craving the kiss that would end everything. And then at the exact same instant, they both flinched back as if they had been electrocuted. Panic flashed in their eyes, the shared terrifying realization of what they had almost done. They had almost broken the contract. They had almost chosen a moment of truth over a year of security. "It's getting late," he said. His voice strained a harsh rasp in the quiet piazza. "Yes, we should go." She replied, her own voice, a breathless whisper. They turned and walked back to the hotel in a suffocating, frantic silence. A full foot of space between them. Each was trapped in their own private terror, horrified not by the man-made rules of their contract, but by the undeniable, uncontrollable laws of their own hearts. The flight back from San Diego was a study in silent, agonizing tension. Julian and Clara sat side by side, a chasm of unspoken words between them. The near kiss in the piazza had shattered their fragile truce. The denial was no longer possible. They both knew the truth, and the knowledge was a dangerous, volatile substance that threatened to explode at any moment. They returned to the penthouse and to their respective wings, the physical distance a welcome if inadequate shield. They avoided each other for 2 days, communicating only through terse, professional text messages. The explosion came not from within, but from the outside world. On the 3rd day, Clara was scrolling through a news feed on her tablet when a headline made her blood run cold. "The Ice Kings Melt Down My Life with Dr. Heartless" by Victoria Hayes. It was an exclusive excerpt from the tell-all memoir of Julian's ex-wife. With a trembling hand, Clara clicked the link. The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. Victoria painted Julian not just as a neglectful husband, but as a cold, unfeeling monster. She twisted his dedication to his work into a pathological obsession, his need for privacy into a sinister secrecy, his quiet nature into a cruel emotional withholding. She detailed fabricated arguments, twisted private moments into public grievances, and portrayed herself as the loving, long-suffering victim of a man incapable of human emotion. The article was a viral sensation. The comment section was a cesspool of vitriol directed at Julian. Sociopath. Narcissist. He saves lives but destroys them at home. Clara felt a white-hot rage build in her chest. It was a lie. All of it. The man she described was a caricature, a villain from a cheap novel. He was not the man who had laughed with her in San Diego, or the man who had gently placed a cool cloth on her forehead in the middle of the night. She found Julian in his study. The room was dark, save for the glow of the city lights outside the massive window. He was standing by the bar, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the counter, a glass in his hand. He was staring out into the darkness, his posture rigid with a pain that was almost a physical presence in the room. "Julian," she said softly from the doorway. He didn't turn. "You shouldn't be here." He said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "Go to your room." "I read the article," she said, ignoring his command and walking further into the room. "It's all lies." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Is it a cold, unfeeling man who uses contracts to manage his relationships?" "Sounds about right, doesn't it?" "No," she said, her voice firm. She walked over to him and gently took the whiskey glass from his hand, placing it on the counter. "She doesn't deserve your pain, Julian. She's not worth it." He finally turned to look at her, and the raw, unguarded agony in his eyes made her heart ache. The carefully constructed walls of the billionaire surgeon had crumbled, leaving only a man who was deeply, profoundly wounded. "And what do you know about it?" he asked, his voice thick with bitterness and self-loathing. "What do you know about what I deserve? I know," she said, her voice softening, her gaze holding his, "that the man she describes in that article is not the man who took care of me when I was sick. He's not the man who made me laugh in a piazza in San Diego. He's not the man I see right now." Her fierce, unexpected loyalty, her unwavering defense of him in the face of his own self-doubt, was the one thing he was not prepared for. It broke through the last of his defenses. The pain, the humiliation, the loneliness, it all coalesced into a single desperate, overwhelming need. With a low groan that came from the depths of his soul, he pulled her to him. His hands tangled in her hair, his mouth crashing down on hers. It was not a kiss of tenderness or of seduction. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was the kiss of a drowning man clinging to his only lifeline. It was raw, hungry, and utterly consuming, a desperate attempt to blot out the pain of the past with the undeniable, breathtaking reality of the present. Clara met his desperation with her own, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body melting against his. This was it, the truth. The inevitable, catastrophic, beautiful truth. The kiss finally ended. They pulled apart, breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. They stared into each other's eyes, the air crackling with the aftershock of what they had just done. The horror of their action dawned on them both at the same moment. They had just, in the most undeniable way possible, broken the contract. It was over. The silence in the study was absolute, broken only by their ragged breathing. The kiss had been a confession, an admission of everything they had been fighting so desperately to deny. The game was over. The rules had been broken. Julian was the first to pull away, stumbling back as if he had been physically struck. He stared at her, his face a mask of horror and self-loathing. He looked at his own hands as if they had betrayed him. "I kissed you," he said, his voice hollow, devoid of all emotion. He was a doctor diagnosing a fatal wound. "I felt attachment." He walked over to his desk, his movement stiff, robotic. He was no longer the passionate, desperate man who had kissed her. He was Dr. Julian Vance, the man of logic, the man of rules. And he was about to enforce the most painful rule he had ever written. According to Article 11 of our agreement, he recited the words sounding like a death sentence. The contract is now terminated. He sat down in his chair, his back ramrod straight, and began typing on his computer. He was preparing the final fund transfer, the severance papers. He was following his own protocol even as it was clearly destroying him. He was amputating the limb to save the body, cutting her out of his life to preserve the cold, empty order he had built around himself. Clara watched him, her heart shattering into a million pieces. He was going to do it. He was actually going to let her go, to push her away, all because of a stupid, impossible clause he had created to protect a heart that was already clearly broken. A fire born of love and a fierce, desperate anger ignited in her soul. She would not let him do this. She would not let him hide behind his own walls. "Wait," she said, her voice trembling but firm. He didn't look up from his screen. "The terms are clear, Clara. I broke the clause. The consequences are automatic." "Then you're a fool," she shot back, walking to his desk and standing before him, forcing him to look at her. He finally raised his eyes, and the pain in them was so profound it stole her breath. "If we're going to be honest," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound strength, "if we're going to invoke the one clause that demands the truth, then let's be completely honest." She took a deep, steadying breath. "You weren't the only one who broke the contract, Julian." She confessed, her gaze unwavering. "I broke it 2 weeks ago, maybe even the first night at the wedding. I fell in love with you. I am in love with you." Her confession hung in the air, a stunning, beautiful countermove. He stared at her, utterly speechless. He had prepared for every contingency, every variable except this one. The impossible clause had created an impossible impasse. He had broken the rule, so he was obligated to end the contract. But she had broken it too. If they were both in breach, who had the right to enforce the penalty? The very rule that was designed to keep them apart now bound them together in their shared mutual guilt. "So what now, Julian?" she asked softly, a challenge in her eyes. "You can't fire me for breaking a rule you broke yourself. You can't enforce a penalty on me that you also deserve. Your perfect, logical, emotion-proof contract, it has a loophole." He looked from her defiant, loving face to the termination papers on his screen. His entire world, a world built on rules and control, had just been turned upside down by the one variable he had refused to entertain. He was a genius, a master of logic, but in that moment, faced with the beautiful, illogical, and undeniable truth of their shared love, he had absolutely no idea what to do. The mutual confession left them in an impossible, suspended state. The contract was broken, yet it couldn't be enforced. They were bound by the very rule that should have torn them apart. The air in the penthouse, once charged with unspoken tension, was now thick with an agonizing spoken truth they had no idea how to navigate. They spent the next 2 days as ghosts in the magnificent apartment, avoiding each other, lost in their own confused thoughts. The foundation of their relationship, the contract, was gone, and they were free-falling without a net. Finally, it was Clara who broke the silence. She found Julian in his study, staring out the window, looking just as lost as she felt. "I have to go," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I can't stay here like this, Julian. Not in this limbo. The contract is broken. The reason I'm here is gone. I need to think. I need space." He turned to face her, his expression etched with a pain that mirrored her own. He wanted to argue to tell her to stay, but he had no right. He was the one who had written the rules. "I understand," he said, his voice rough. Leaving the penthouse felt like tearing a part of herself away. She returned to her old modest apartment in Pilsen, which her mother had been keeping up. The debts were gone. Her mother's health was secure. The practical reasons for the contract were fulfilled, but her life, which should have felt free and unburdened, now felt empty, colorless. The silence in her small apartment was a hollow ache, a stark contrast to the charged, meaningful silence she had shared with Julian. Julian, meanwhile, was adrift in his own cold, empty fortress. The penthouse, once his sanctuary of order and control, was now a monument to his failure. Her absence was a physical presence, a void in every room. He would walk past her door and feel a pang of loss so sharp it was like a physical blow. He had built a world to protect himself from emotion, and now he was drowning in it. He had lost. He had tried to control love, and love had shattered his perfect, logical world. A week after Clara left his mother, Vivian arrived at the penthouse for their scheduled weekly dinner. She found him in his study, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring at a blank wall. The house was immaculate, but it felt dead. "Good heavens, Julian," she said, her sharp eyes taking in his disheveled appearance, the emptiness in his eyes. "You look dreadful." "Where is that girl, the Jensen girl?" "She's gone," Julian said, his voice flat. "Gone." "What do you mean gone? I was just beginning to like her. She had a spine, unlike that insipid textile heiress." Vivian sniffed her disapproval of his previous potential matches, still potent. "What did you do?" Julian, for the first time in his life, told his mother the complete truth. He told her about the contract, the impossible clause, the kiss, the mutual confession, and Clara's departure. Vivian listened, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. He expected a lecture. Told you so," about the folly of getting involved with someone from a different world. Instead, she let out an exasperated sigh. "You, my son," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle, "are a brilliant, brilliant idiot." She stood up and walked over to him. "You create a ridiculous self-sabotaging rule to protect yourself from getting hurt. And when you finally find a woman with the strength and character to actually break through it, you let her walk away because of it. Of all the foolish, illogical things you have ever done, this is by far the most stupid." Julian stared at her, stunned. His mother, the formidable matriarch who had orchestrated his social life with an iron fist, the woman who had pushed him toward appropriate matches, was taking Clara's side. She patted his cheek, a rare gesture of affection. "I don't know what ridiculous agreement you two had, but I know what I saw. That girl looks at you like you hung the moon, and you, my son, haven't looked this alive, this human, since before your father died. Now stop moping and go fix the mess you made." With that, she turned and left him alone in the study. Her words, the most unexpected blessing, the most surprising validation, were like a key turning in a lock he didn't even know was there. A few minutes later, Vivian, from the privacy of her car, made a phone call. "Clara, my dear," she said, her voice warm and conspiratorial. "It's Vivian Vance. I do hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm calling because my son is being an idiot, and I believe you are the only one who can fix him." Vivian's phone call left Clara stunned. The woman she had viewed as a formidable judgmental obstacle had just become her most unlikely ally. The conversation was brief, but Vivian's message was clear. "My son is miserable without you. Go get him." But Clara knew it wasn't her move to make. She had confessed her feelings. She had shown him her heart. The next step, if there was to be one, had to come from him. He had to be the one to choose to break his own rules, to step out of his fortress of logic and into the messy, unpredictable world of real emotion. Meanwhile, Julian was a man unmade. His mother's words had stripped away his last defense, the cold, hard logic of the contract. He had followed his own rules to the letter, and they had led him to this empty, silent hell. He had won the battle for control, but had lost the war for happiness. He thought about Clara. He thought about her fierce loyalty when his ex-wife's book was released. He thought about her laughter in San Diego. He thought about the look in her eyes when she had confessed her love for him, a look of such raw, terrifying honesty. He realized that his entire life had been about mitigating risk, controlling variables, protecting himself. But the greatest risk, he now understood, was not in loving and getting hurt. The greatest risk was in never loving at all. He couldn't stand the silence of the penthouse for another second. He grabbed his car keys and drove with no destination in mind. He found himself an hour later, parked across the street from the small, unassuming diner where he had first presented her with the contract. He watched the waitresses bustling inside, the steam fogging up the windows. It felt like a lifetime ago. He saw her. She was sitting alone at a small table by the window, a cup of coffee cradled in her hands, staring out at the street with a sad, distant look in her eyes. She looked beautiful and fragile, and completely out of his reach. For a long moment, he just sat there, his heart pounding. Dr. Julian Vance, who could hold a human brain in his hands without a tremor, was terrified of walking across the street and speaking to a waitress. Taking a deep breath, he got out of the car. He walked into the diner, the bell above the door chiming, announcing his arrival, just as it had before. She looked up, and her eyes widened in surprise. He walked to her table and sat down in the chair opposite her. He didn't speak, just looked at her, taking in the sight of her, memorizing the curve of her lips, the intelligence in her eyes. "You were right," he said. Finally, his voice raw and quiet. "I was a fool. I built a fortress of ice around myself to protect me from a pain that happened years ago, and I didn't even realize I was freezing to death inside it." He reached across the table, his hand hovering over hers, not daring to touch her without permission. "And then you came along. You didn't try to break down the walls. You just brought so much warmth and light that you melted them from the inside out. I'm terrified, Clara. I'm terrified of feeling this much for someone, but I've learned in the last week that I'm much more terrified of the thought of living the rest of my life without you." He slid a document across the table. It wasn't a contract. It was a single first-class, open-ended plane ticket to anywhere in the world. "You are free, Clara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Truly free. The trust for your mother's care is irrevocable. It's secured for her lifetime, no matter what. You don't owe me anything. You can take this ticket, and you can go anywhere, be anyone, build any life you want. And I will never bother you again." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "But I hope," he whispered, his voice breaking, "that you choose to stay. I hope you choose me." He stood up his chair, scraping against the linoleum floor. He didn't wait for her answer. He couldn't. He had laid his heart, his hope, and his vulnerability on the table. He had given her the ultimate choice, with no strings, no clauses, no conditions. He turned and walked out of the diner, leaving her alone with the ticket to anywhere and the unspoken question of whether her world was still with him. Clara sat in the quiet diner, the murmur of conversations and the clinking of cutlery fading into a distant hum. The only thing that felt real was the plane ticket resting on the table in front of her. It was a slip of paper that represented absolute freedom. Paris, Rome, Tokyo. A new life, a blank page, a chance to be the artist she had always dreamed of being, with no debts, no worries, no attachments. It was everything she should have wanted. But as she looked at it, she didn't feel a thrill of excitement. She felt a profound, hollow ache. A world without Julian in it, no matter how beautiful or exotic, felt like a world in black and white. He was the color. He was the warmth. He was the chaotic, terrifying, beautiful variable that made her feel alive. She thought of his face when he had made his plea, the raw vulnerability, the fear, the hope. He had given her the ultimate gift, a choice with no strings attached. He had finally truly trusted her. She didn't need to think. Her heart had already made its decision weeks ago. She left the ticket on the table, a silent offering to a life she no longer wanted, and walked out of the diner. Julian was in his study, pacing like a caged animal. He had been staring at his phone for an hour, waiting, hoping, dreading. He had played his final card, and now he had no moves left. He was completely, utterly powerless. He heard the soft chime of his private elevator arriving at the penthouse floor. His heart stopped. He stood frozen, barely breathing, listening to the soft footsteps approaching his office. The door opened. It was Clara. She stood in the doorway, her expression calm and certain. She didn't say a word. She walked to his desk where a framed photo of his parents sat. She picked it up, then walked to the bar where the open plane ticket lay. She placed the ticket on the bar, then walked to the large abstract painting on the wall. "What are you doing?" He finally asked, his voice a whisper. "I'm redecorating," she said simply. She walked back to him, stopping just a few feet away. "I don't want a ticket to the world, Julian." She said, her voice soft but ringing with a strength that filled the vast room. "I already have my world." She took a step closer. "It's here with you." The relief that washed over his face was so profound. It was like watching a statue come to life. He crossed the space between them in a single stride, his hands coming up to frame her face as if to be sure she was real. "I thought I'd lost you." He breathed, his forehead resting against hers. "Never." She whispered, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the frantic, relieved beating of his heart. "I love you, Clara," he said, his voice thick with emotion, muffled by her hair. "I love you, Julian." She replied, her voice full of a joy so pure it brought tears to her eyes. They had found their way back to each other, not by following the rules, but by having the courage to break them. The weeks that followed were a revelation, living together without the suffocating weight of the contract. They discovered the simple, beautiful rhythm of being a real couple. They learned each other's habits, the way he always left his coffee cup on the edge of the counter, the way she hummed softly when she was sketching. They had late-night conversations that had nothing to do with public appearances and everything to do with their hopes, their fears, and their shared future. Julian, for his part, was a man transformed. The cold clinical surgeon was replaced by a warm, attentive partner. He would come home from the hospital, and the first thing he would do was find her. His smile genuine, his eyes full of a love he no longer tried to hide. He took a genuine interest in her art, converting one of the penthouse spare rooms into a beautiful, light-filled studio for her, without her even having to ask. One evening, about a month after she had returned, he came home with a mysterious smile on his face. "Put on something nice," he said, his eyes sparkling with a secret. "We have a reservation." "A reservation where?" she asked, intrigued. "You'll see," was all he would say. He took her back to the St. Regis Ballroom, the hotel where their strange, complicated story had begun. But he didn't lead her to the grand ballroom. Instead, he led her up a private elevator to a stunning rooftop terrace that had been closed to the public for the night. The terrace was empty, save for a single table set for two, surrounded by hundreds of flickering candles. In the corner, a lone cellist was playing the same soft classical music that had been playing the night of the wedding. "Julian, what is all this?" Clara breathed, completely overwhelmed. "This is where we had our first pretend moment," he said, taking her hands in his. "I wanted our first real one to be here too." He looked at her, his gray eyes, once so cold and analytical, now filled with a warmth and a love so profound it made her heart ache. "Our contract is over, Clara." He began, his voice low and serious. "But I find myself wanting to propose a new one, a permanent one." He slowly got down on one knee. The billionaire neurosurgeon, the man who commanded boardrooms and operating theaters, was kneeling before her under the stars. He pulled a small velvet box from his pocket and opened it. Inside was a simple, elegant diamond ring that glittered in the candlelight. It wasn't a flashy, ostentatious stone. It was tasteful, timeless, and perfect. "Clara Jensen," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he made no attempt to conceal. "You came into my life as a variable I couldn't control, and you became the only thing I can't live without. You taught me that a life without risk is a life without joy, and a heart without love is just an organ. Our first agreement had an impossible clause. I want to make you a new one with no clauses, no conditions, no end date." He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes. "Will you marry me, Clara, for real this time?" Tears of pure, unadulterated joy streamed down her face. She was laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes," she whispered, her voice choked with happiness. "Yes, of course, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit. He stood up, pulling her into his arms and kissing her. A deep, loving kiss that held the promise of a lifetime. It was a kiss that sealed their new and final agreement. 1 year later, Clara stood in that same sun-dappled garden where she had once felt like an outsider. But this time she was the bride, and the joy was real. Their wedding was an intimate, beautiful affair, attended only by their closest friends and family. Clara's mother, her face glowing with health and happiness, sat in the front row, weeping openly. Vivian Vance sat beside her, patting her hand in a gesture of shared motherly pride, a rare, genuine smile on her own face. As Clara walked down the aisle, she only had eyes for Julian. He stood waiting for her, not with the cool, detached air of a man playing a part, but with an open, adoring expression that was meant only for her. The love in his eyes was a tangible force, a warm, brilliant light. Their vows were simple, heartfelt, and deeply personal, filled with inside jokes and promises that held the weight of their unique journey. Later at the reception, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the happy guests, Julian pulled her away for a quiet moment. They stood by the same fountain where they had first seen each other across a crowded room. "I have something for you," he said, a mischievous glint in his eye. He reached into the pocket of his tuxedo and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. It was a cocktail napkin from the hotel bar. "Our final contract," he said, handing it to her. She unfolded it. On it, he had written a single sentence in his sharp, decisive handwriting. "The final clause party. A Julian and Party B, Clara, hereby agree to break the emotional attachment termination clause joyfully and with extreme prejudice every single day for the rest of their lives." Below it were 2 lines for signatures. Clara laughed a sound of pure, unadulterated joy that echoed in the twilight. "This is the best contract you've ever written," she said. He produced a pen from his pocket. "Shall we make it official?" They leaned against the fountain, using the cool marble as a makeshift desk, and signed their names on the napkin. He took it from her, folded it carefully, and placed it back in his pocket close to his heart. "Binding for a lifetime," He said, his voice full of a love so deep it was bottomless. He pulled her into his arms and kissed her a slow, sweet kiss that held all the promises of their future. Their story had started with a lie whispered in a crowded room, a game of pretend with impossible rules. But it had ended here, with a truth written on a napkin, a testament to the beautiful, undeniable fact that the best rules are the ones that are broken by love. Julian left the room, but the cold didn't leave with him. It settled deep in the air, a terrifying silence that screamed louder than any shout. I lay there trembling, not from the fever anymore, but from the raw, undeniable truth his panic had revealed. I was a threat to his rules. He was terrified not of catching the flu, but of losing control over the only thing he couldn't schedule budget or dissect his own heart. I saw the genius surgeon, the billionaire ice king, crumble under the weight of a simple human emotion, and for the first time I felt a connection to him that was more dangerous than any legal document. The contract was about my mother's life, but the real stakes were now ours. This wasn't just a business transaction anymore. It was a battleground where my heart and his fortress of logic were set to destroy each other. I was terrified of falling in love with a man who had made ruin the penalty for intimacy. But worse than that, I was terrified of staying silent and letting that tiny, fragile spark of human connection die. Julian had written the rules, but maybe I could show him the loophole. I had to choose between the safety of silence and the devastating freedom of truth. I know how crazy this sounds. To bet your whole future, your mother's life, on the hope that the coldest man in Chicago might choose a messy, unpredictable heart over his perfect, logical world. But sometimes, when you've lost everything, the only thing left to gamble is hope itself. I'm standing at the edge of the next chapter now, and believe me, it only gets harder. I'm taking this story public because I need witnesses. I need someone to hold me accountable, to root for the impossible choice. I'm Clara Jensen. This is my battle, and I'm asking you to stand with me. If you've ever had to fight for a love that seemed utterly impossible, if you've ever traded your peace for someone else's survival, then I need to know you hear me. Comment, "We're listening," below. Let me know you're on my side, that I'm not crazy for wanting the man who owns the contract. And please, if this story is going to reach the end, if I'm going to have the courage to tell you how I found the loophole in his impossible contract, I need your help. Subscribe to my channel now. Every single subscription is a vote of confidence, a sign that my story, and maybe yours too, deserves to be heard. Thank you for listening. Let's face the next chapter together.